While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another episode of the Boss Body Podcast. Minerals. We know that they're important. We know that they're super important. You can't use our vitamins without them. But a lot of times we get lured into taking massive quantities of one mineral, and we create other mineral imbalances without considering the cofactors. So minerals are like the spark plugs in your body. And Morley Robbins knows as much or more than anyone on the planet about minerals and how they interact and how that plays a role in homeostatic perturbations or derivations away from homeostasis. So welcome to the show, Morley.
It's great to be here, Tim. It's been a long gap since our last conversation, but I have a feeling this is going to make up for lost time.
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like you've been busy I know that you were a hospital administrator for, I think, 32 years, and you have an M.B.A. That's quite a leap to go from that to what you're doing now.
Yeah. A friend of mine says if you spend 1,000 hours, you can become an expert. Well, I blew past that about a decade ago. So 2 to 3 hours a day for 15 years, 7 days a week, you start reading scientific literature. You learn a lot. I specialize, obviously, as you noted, in minerals. But even within that, there are only 3 that I really go bonkers about, and that's magnesium, copper, and iron. And it's a fascinating world, as you well know, as a very gifted practitioner in your own right. And I think people don't realize just how important, but also how simple these dynamics can be. And
Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to tease that apart in our time together.
Absolutely. One thing, I had Dr. Chandler Mars on the show recently, and she wrote a book with Dr. Derek Lonsdale on thiamine deficiency and dysautonomia. And she brought up the point, or reminded me that, if you need B1 and thiamine to work not only on insulin sensitivity, but to work as a cofactor with magnesium. So can you touch on that real quick?
Yeah, I think there's also agents in the food system that are working against B1, as you well know. And so that's the other side of this, is we live in a very toxic world, and an insanely toxic world. It's got a lot more toxic during the time that we haven't been talking. But the B vitamins are easily lost to stress, along with magnesium. They're the first to go. And I've had a long-standing belief that all of the B vitamins have an important relationship with copper, not just with magnesium. And their job is really to help regulate iron. And I posed that theory to Leslie Clavet, who's a world-renowned copper expert, many, many years ago. And he said, well, Morley, that's a really intriguing idea. He said, I can't speak for all of the B vitamins. He said, but what I can tell you for a fact is that folate, B9, is in fact copper dependent. Well, I can begin to tick and tack the data to get B12 is absolutely copper dependent, B5 copper dependent, B3 very close relationship, and we work our way back to B1. When I learn about the fact that there's a part of the formal name is pyro, meaning fire, well, then I'm really beginning to wonder, how do people miss that there's a copper side to this as well?
Right.
And so I know how important B1 is. I think we all do. But in a synthetic form, I'm not as excited about it. And so we have to be really careful about the forms that we get it in. And again, the challenge is finding food sources that have naturally occurring forms. So that's the ongoing challenge that we all face. And yes, B1 is instrumental in so many areas, but I think we have to be thoughtful about how we support ourselves with that.
Yeah. And I just think it's interesting because I know you've talked about this from like the first time I met you 12 years ago, or started, conversing with you 12 years ago, but about the importance of copper and how you don't like the term or the phrase copper toxicity. It's really copper dysfunction, copper dysregulation. Can you touch on, because I think a lot of the listeners and viewers, they don't necessarily connect copper and iron in their mind. Like they think of iron as, okay, if it's low, then I'm anemic. It may affect my thyroid, but they don't tie it into copper. Could you touch on that?
Sure. It's funny. I've been engaged in this mineral process for about 15 years now. And just a few months ago, I had this lightning bolt moment when I realized, wait a minute, copper is toxic to big pharma revenue.
Right.
So the phrase, what people need to understand is where did it come from? Well, a lot of people may have heard of Carl Pfeiffer, famous PhD, MD. He was actually a psychiatrist. What people may not know is he was an instrumental player in the MK Ultra program.
Okay.
So when I learn things like that, I tend to kind of shy back from what they're saying. But he wrote a very important article in the 60s about copper becoming unbound from ceruloplasmin. And he was very precise in the words that he used. And then what happened was that phrase morphed into unbound copper, and then that unbound copper became copper toxicity. And it's like, okay, so let's tease that apart. The reason why we're here on the planet, why any life form is here on the planet, the reason why you and I are having this conversation on very fancy devices is that higher order technology requires higher order thinking, requires higher order energy production.
Okay.
And early life made energy anaerobically because there was no oxygen on the planet. So anaerobic glycolysis requires 10 enzymes, and 8 of them require magnesium. So that's, magnesium is very important. We know that. Well, in order to burn sugars and fat, you got to have oxygen, and you got to have copper to manage that process. And so we go from anaerobic glycolysis, which is 2 molecules of ATP, to oxidative burning of fat.
36.
36. And then we go to fat, a unit of fat, we're at 140. There's a big difference between 2 and 140. And so who knew that best? A guy named Otto Warburg. He knew all about that. He never liked to talk about copper. But the thing is, what happens under stress, under certain conditions in our diet, the protein that's instrumental for managing copper is called ceruloplasmin. It's a beast of a protein. It's 1,066 amino acids. When it was first discovered, there were 8 copper ions in it. Now we're supposed to believe it's only 6. Where did those two? I've never met a copper expert who could explain to me how those two atoms disappeared. Because there was a period when for 30 years it was 8, and then for 30 years it's 7, and more recently it's 6. I've even seen references in the literature where they think it might only be 5. That should make everyone very nervous that they keep. Think of your V8 engine missing 2 cylinders, and they're now taking out another one.
Right.
That should make them very nervous. And so what happens under stress is that ceruloplasmin protein, the conformational structure of it changes. There's a critical tyrosine amino acid that can get oxidized, and it's like a trap door, and the coppers come rushing out like diarrhea, literally, and they are unbound from ceruloplasmin, but they're very quickly bound by histidine, transcuprine, and albumin. Well, they have different properties when they're bound to those agents than they did when they were in ceruloplasmin. And the part that I think is really important in light of our discussion today is that one of the most offensive agents to blow up ceruloplasmin is called hyperglycemia. When we have an excessive rise of blood sugar, and this was just published in 2019 by a team out of Russia, that hyperglycemia causes the ceruloplasmin protein to break apart. Well, then we have this flood of sugars, and what I'm piecing together, Tim, is I really think one of ceruloplasmin's most important jobs. We know it's regulating oxygen. We know it's regulating iron. I think it also regulates sugar, and that when we're faced with hyperglycemia, out of control blood sugars, copper is no longer in its antioxidant protein, and that's when all the chaos starts. And what I've just come across, which I think you'll find fascinating, is we all know about parasites, Parasites. Well, there's a whole nother realm of physiology around pericytes, Pericytes, and pericytes are surrounding the microcirculation. When we get down into the really tiny blood vessels,
Like the capillary beds.
Capillary beds, the pericytes are monitoring hemodynamics. And guess what? They have the ability to secrete the PAM enzyme. And so suddenly, what is considered the real origin of diabetes is when there is an uncontrollable loss of parasites because they get drowned by excess glucose. And so they lose the ability to regulate the blood sugars because we've been trained that there's only one hormone that does it. It's called insulin.
Right.
No, let's talk about insulin growth factor. Let's talk about incretin. Let's talk about joining peptide. Let's talk about humanin. Let's talk about spexin. And my favorite of all, chromogranin A. Most people have never even heard of it. And when chromogranin A gets tweaked, insulin doesn't get activated. And I learned that it was a 2022 dissertation out of Cambridge. And it's like, wow, we're into the micronutrient elements, but what's important for the listeners to understand is that all of those hormones that I just named, all 7 of them, need to be activated by the PAM enzyme, and the PAM enzyme is activated by copper. And so I have a hard time when people talk to me about copper toxicity. I'm like, you don't really understand what copper does. It's creating the energy, it's clearing the exhaust, it's coordinating everything through the PAM enzyme, it's coloring everything through melanin. I mean, it's actually laughable because people pick up a narrative and they don't realize that the system is just playing with us. They're just
Right.
continuing the lie, as it were. So
yeah. So very thorough answer. I really appreciate that. With the PAM enzyme, so if I remember correctly, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, uh, downregulates or decreases the production of ceruloplasmin, correct?
Yes, yes.
And so if that's the case, stressors, like you said, whether it's external, internal, psychological, it's going to decrease the bioavailability of copper. Correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand that as you're talking about cortisol triggers a 4 to 5-fold increase in metallothionein. Metallothionein binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. And everyone's very zinc focused and because of COVID, and it's like, oh my gosh. And so people didn't realize that the COVID cocktail they were taking, the ascorbic acid, the vitamin D, and the zinc, is the perfect recipe to blow up the bioavailability of copper. And so once it was only a few weeks into 2020 when I realized, we got a problem in Houston. And I mean, it was very disorienting because people were so, and for the right reasons, we were all afraid in the early stages. And people need to understand that this mechanism of cortisol that gets released under stress has a very powerful effect of basically immobilizing copper in the body. And so under acute stress, you're going to lose magnesium and the B vitamins. We talked about that. Under chronic stress, the copper gets locked up. And then we lose the ability to get to that higher level of energy production. And then we become very vulnerable under that situation.
Yeah, so I think where a lot of people get confused is they are unsure, or they start supplementing with small doses of copper and they feel pretty terrible because they're not addressing the HPA axis, the stressors, the other minerals. Can you touch on that? And when should maybe people consider beginning supplementing with copper?
Yeah. So let's back up a step. Let's go back to 1928.
Okay.
Let's go back to March of 28 at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and May of 1928, University of Kentucky in Louisville. And what those two teams did, independent research, they denied copper to the animals, their rodents, and they wanted to see what's going to happen. So they withheld copper completely from the diet and discovered in both studies that iron rose in the liver in the animals. And it's a known biological phenomenon, but low copper causes iron accumulation. That's a very important thing to know. What's fascinating is to know that in 2021, Leon Gonzalez studied 13 genes, several that are related to iron metabolism in the liver, several that related to zinc metabolism, and several that related to copper metabolism in the liver. And they wanted to see, of those 13 genes, would any of them upregulate in the presence of copper deficiency? And what they discovered is that only one gene upregulated, and it's called ferritin light chain, FTL1. And FTL1 went off like a rocket, and that's the gene that allows for ferritin light chain production, which stores iron in the liver. So about 100 years later, they were able to prove genetically that Hart et al. At Wisconsin and McHarg et al. At Kentucky were right. They knew they were right, but they had definitive proof. And so people need to understand, really understand, that there's a very deep connection between copper and iron biologically in our body. And they also need to understand we live in a copper desert now. The world, by virtue of glyphosate and high fructose corn syrup and fourth generation antibiotics, are wiping copper off of this planet. And people don't know that. And so that's a very significant event. And so the meme that runs medicine on this planet is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And people have heard that thousands of times throughout their life, and they believe it because that's what programming does. It gets us to believe the most insane lie, and that is a lie because we are copper deserts and we are iron toxic, and the average person doesn't know that. And we don't have nearly enough copper, and we have way too much iron in our physiology. And so the protocol that I developed a number of years ago, called the root cause protocol, has a series of stops and starts, as you know. And what I encourage people to do is stop the nutritional insanity that's out there. Stop taking iron supplements, stop taking calcium, stop taking zinc, stop taking ascorbic acid, things of that nature. The one that's very controversial, as you probably know, stop taking vitamin D. I encourage people to get it in cod liver oil, where you're getting A and D. I'm not saying don't take vitamin D, just don't take a synthetic form of it. But I think the reaction that you're referring to, Tim, about people taking copper and they don't feel right, what's really important for people to understand is that copper is here for a reason. It's the only element on the planet that can regulate oxygen and iron at the same time. And what do oxygen and iron like to do? They like to create rust. It's not a good thing. We know what rust is like on the outside of the body. People don't realize that the plaque in their arteries is basically a form of rusting. And so copper is here to prevent that process. As I said earlier, I think it's also here to prevent the oxidation from sugars, but that's a more controversial stance, and I don't have any research to back it up yet. But I think the key is once you introduce copper into a copper desert body that's been storing iron for decades, the iron gets mobilized. And it's the mobilized iron that's causing the symptoms that are all being assigned to copper. So I think people have to kind of step back from their narrative and their belief system, because if I were Satan, I would want you to believe that you are anemic and that you're copper toxic. I would want you sucking down iron like there was no tomorrow, believing that you will need more. And I would want you terrified of copper, when in fact, I would regard it as one of the most important nutrients on the planet, if not the most important. And so the structure of the protocol is designed to ease people. If people just did the stops, Tim, they'd have an enormous sense of recovery. You have no idea how people feel just by doing the stops, getting the calcium and the ascorbic acid and all that garbage out of their routine. And then what we've done is we've phased the starts. And we don't dive into copper right away, although you could, but we recognize that people need to build up their minerals and their adrenals. And where's a lot of PAM expression taking place? In the adrenals. It's not just the hypothalamus. Actually, what's fascinating, the highest concentration of PAM enzyme is the atria of the heart. It's amazing. And who knew, right? So I think the fear that people have about copper is not warranted. And I understand it. I'm a product of the programming as well. But I think as you get into doing the fundamentals of the protocol, people don't have an issue. And then, the book that I wrote about Cure Your Fatigue, I wrote that in 2020. And then and then I decided to rename what COVID stands for. So COV stands for coppers vanished, and ID stands for irons dysregulated. And I think you understand where I'm going with that. The average person's like, oh, what's he talking about? But when you get into sudden death, myocarditis, there's only one explanation for that. There's no copper in the heart. and there's excess iron. And that's the work of, again, Leslie Clavet, identifying 80 anatomical, chemical, and physiological defects in an article he wrote in 2002. And so doctors don't know that as a rule because they're not taught about minerals. I was recently with a very, very, very high profile physician who specializes in neurodegeneration, having dinner with him and some of his colleagues. And I'm sitting right next to him. And I'm just curious, what do you know about the PAM enzyme? He said, what? And he said, what does it stand for? So I gave him the 87 letters long explanation. He said, I've never heard of it. And I've yet to meet a doctor, a classically trained conventional doctor, who even knows what we're talking about, Tim. And it's a scary moment because the 7 hormones that I mentioned about glucose regulation, well, there's probably 50. I just happen to memorize 7 of them. And they all need to be activated before they work.
Right.
It's like expecting your microphone to work, but not be plugged in. And so it's just, we live in this insane world of make-believe where there's all sorts of do this, don't do that. And it's all just narrative. You know that. You're preaching about this all the time. It's just this constant process of trying to wake people up gently to the reality of the world that we live in.
Absolutely. And so obviously ceruloplasmin, how do you say it? What's the correct pronunciation?
Ceruloplasmin.
Ceruloplasmin.
I had to say it 1,000 times when I narrated my book. Man,
yeah. It's a tongue twister. I've been saying it incorrectly. So
right.
Obviously we need to address the stressors, whether it's an infection, a circadian disruption, non-native EMFs, mold toxicity, etc. But how else can we go about building up the ceruloplasmin before supplementing with copper?
Well, we've got to get rid of. Great question. We've got to deal with our stress, right? And if Mildred Seelig were here, famed magnesium expert, she would tell us there's 4 types of stress. We have physical stress, we have metabolic stress, we have environmental stress, and we have psychological, emotional stress. Buried within her model is probably the most important stress, and that's called oxidative stress. We live on a planet with oxygen. It's not our friend. The most important chemical transaction on planet Earth is happening within our mitochondria at complex 4, where oxygen, a molecule of oxygen, O2, becomes 2 molecules of water. And that comes at the blessing of copper. And what people need to understand is that there's 2 heme groups at complex 4, and there are several copper atoms there. But at the critical part where oxygen does need to become water, the heme groups basically function as a stove. They're holding the oxygen. And who's slicing and dicing it, moving the hydrogens in, moving the electrons in? That's copper. That's its gift. That's its genius. And so all of the optics of conventional medicine are on the stove, and nobody knows about the chef. So it's not where we are. Our training doesn't allow us to understand that. And so we don't have the wherewithal because we're just not trained in that. And the key is getting people to realize that there's very sophisticated mechanisms in our body to deal with this oxygen thing. And so the oxidative stress is really, really powerful. And that's the major stressor. And when we're under stress, any one of those 4 that Dr. Seelig talks about, we get hypoxia. And hypoxia is not being at the top of Mount Everest. There's a functional form of hypoxia. It's called functional hypoxia. And it's the lack of bioavailable copper to activate oxygen to become water. And if we can't do that because we lack the copper, that's when there's this magnification of the problem. And that's where all conditions start, is cellular energy deficiency, which is oxygen can't be activated. And if it can't be activated, it's going to be turned into an oxidant, into a reactive oxygen species. Most important concept for people to understand is that the body knows what to do with oxygen in the presence of copper.
And
But
doesn't that copper need to be in the 3+ valency state?
no, copper actually works between +1 and +2. So intracellular copper is +1. Extracellular, it's oxidized, it's +2. Iron, on the other hand, has the +2, +3. So ferrous iron +2, that's the workhorse of hemoglobin. That's 70 to 80% of your iron is in the +2 state. When it becomes oxidized, goes into a +3 state, then it can be bound to proteins like transferrin, or it can be put into ferritin, the storage protein. And it's important for people to realize that this movement, these are the only metals that have this capacity. It's called redox regulation. And these are the metals that are reacting with oxygen. And it's a very unique concept on the planet, and they play a very special role. That tension between copper and iron and oxygen is everything on the planet.
I remember, I think this was back in 2017, and I don't know the name of the company. They sent me a bottle of, I think it's called Synergy, but it's supposed to have copper in the, you don't remember it?
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah, I do.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, they claim that it has to be in the 3+ valency state.
What Charlie Barker was saying was we needed to have it he was talking about proper copper, and it was the +1. It was and what happens is you can take a field of soil, spray it with copper sulfate, and that's in the +2. And what the microbes do in the soil is turn the +2 into a +1, puts it in the root system, and when it's in the produce, it's going to be a +1. And it's that dynamic of +1, +2 for copper, and +2, +3 for iron. That's what runs the planet. It's called redox regulation, and it's a very, very powerful dynamic.
Wow. Yeah. So for people that are listening who want to start supplementing with copper, touch on the first things that are included in the root cause protocol. Like, I remember the orange juice cocktail. Is that still part of it with the electrolytes?
Absolutely.
Can you touch on why you included that so people can understand?
Well, it's really where the adrenals are this critical filter for stress. It's absolutely essential. And so people need to understand that if the sentry that's keeping track of stress is not properly nourished, it's not going to react properly. And so what are the adrenals like? They love minerals, especially magnesium and sodium and potassium. They really need vitamin C, but not ascorbic acid. Whole food vitamin C is a very different metabolite completely, because it's got an engine at the center of it called tyrosinase. And Tim, I would argue that tyrosinase is probably the most understudied, misunderstood enzyme on planet Earth. And maybe in a subsequent chat we can talk about that. But it's a very poorly understood enzyme found at the center of real vitamin C. And the other component is retinol. Now, Tom Cowan has a great phrase when he's talking about adrenal fatigue. He actually says it's fat deficiency syndrome. And it took me a while to really understand what he was talking about. He was really talking about being short on retinol, vitamin A. And vitamin A is really important for the adrenals. And what I've come across is when you get into a medical dictionary, look up all the conditions that start with the letter A, and they can all be addressed by increasing your intake of retinol. It's fascinating. Like appendicitis and anxiety, and you can go down the list.
Yeah.
But the key is that getting the adrenals back online, getting them in proper regulation, getting them to understand that they play a critical role in this powerhouse of signaling. We talk about the PAM enzyme, and you were talking about the HPA axis. Well, that's the highway for the PAM enzyme, and the other highway, of course, is, I guess it really is the vagus nerve. That's where it's really being expressed. And depending upon the author, they'll tell you that it could be as few as 43 hormones that are activated by PAM, or as much as 4,700.
Right.
And so hormones work just like our phones. If they're not turned on, if they can't talk to each other, they can't communicate with each other, there's dysregulation.
Right.
And everyone has heard of insulin resistance. It's a fascinating term. People have heard of leptin resistance, cortisol resistance, estrogen resistance. But no one's pulled the curtain back to say, why is there resistance? Because the body's not able to activate them, not able to allow them to have their proper expression. And I'm not sure everyone has had a chance to see the new Tom Cruise movie, The Mission Impossible, but they talk about the cruciform key in that movie. And we have receptors that are open, and hormones are made closed, and they need to be opened. And the PAM enzyme is what opens them up, so that the hormone and the receptor can have a perfect contact. And if you watch the movie Mission Impossible, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Once they connect like that, lights go on, and it's like, oh, I mean, I was so glad I went to see that movie, because now I understand how hormones really work. And so cruciform connections are really powerful, and that's what really runs the signaling in the body. And the adrenal glands is a critical locus for where that's taking place. So that's really why it's a major priority in the protocol, is to bring them back online, because hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals are these three nodes of activity. And it isn't just them. I was talking with a colleague just the other day, and he was working with a couple from Romania who had very low PAM expression. He's developed a tester, and he also has a tester for PAM antibody. That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
But he tested them for PAM, very low expression, PAM antibody, off the chart expression. He cleared the antibody expression, and he said, Morley, it was like I flipped a light switch. Suddenly, PAM had global expression throughout the body, from head to toe. He was blown away by it. And the most amazing part about this conversation, Tim, is that I've yet to meet a classically trained doctor who knows what we're talking about.
Right. And so with the PAM enzyme, what are ways to improve it besides decreasing the antibody expression? And the test that you mentioned, is that available to?
It's a practitioner he's a genius. So he's developed sort of with muscle testing, he's able to use it as a tester, if you will. And so what's really fun for people to know is that there's a husband and wife team that have been studying the PAM enzyme for 45 years. Richard Maines and his wife, Betty Eiper, both got their doctorates at Harvard. They spent 20 years at Hopkins studying this enzyme. Then they got recruited to UConn Medical Center up in Farmington, Connecticut. And that's a long time to study one enzyme, 45. That's a lot of funding.
Mhm.
Somebody was really interested in knowing about the PAM enzyme. And it was a very critical window, 2009 to 2012, where some very innovative research was being done. And the studies that I find most fascinating were they took two groups of rats, poor little rats, but they made one group copper deficient. And the second group, they altered the gene expression for PAM to lower its functional activity. So the two groups had the same functional capacity for PAM expression. Now, everyone should put on their seatbelt, take a little tug, because what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind, because the best part of the research was they then, after they had these two lower expressing groups of PAM, they fed both groups copper supplements. And guess what happened? Both groups came back online, both the copper deprived and the genetically altered. Now, what does that tell me? It tells us that gene defects might just be nutrient deficiencies, especially copper. What people don't know, what a lot of people may not know, is that there are exons as opposed to introns. There's exons, and those exons have copper binding sites. Ceruloplasmin has 20 copper binding sites. What's very hard to find in the literature is how many copper binding sites are in each gene. So it's a beast of an effort. But the point is, the PAM enzyme, I know, has to have copper binding sites because it has an absolute requirement for magnesium presence. And so the ability to bring this critical enzyme back online is a function of restoring sanity in your nutrient routine. And that's where the stops and the starts begin to reinforce that and allow people to the extent that you can find real food. We basically endorse the Weston A. Price diet. It's ancestral food is going to be your best bet. You know, eat seasonally, eat locally to the extent that you can, and know that your body has a blueprint. We really do have this incredible, very sophisticated signaling system, but it needs energy, and that energy comes from copper. And so it's not to narrowcast it, because there are other nutrients that are needed. We know that. But the one that's the most missing, in my humble opinion, Tim, is copper, just because it's being attacked on so many different levels within the farming, food processing, and pharmaceutical system.
I hear a lot of people, I know you do a lot of hair mineral analysis, and I've heard and read a lot of people who are in that arena talk about copper dumping. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, again, I think what people are picking up is the concept of ceruloplasmin. You first of all, you can't measure ceruloplasmin in a hair test, and that's why I went to blood testing. In addition, you got to have both. You can't base decisions solely on a hair test. You've got to have blood testing too. We could get really sophisticated and do all sorts of testing, but those two I find to be very focused. But you can't measure ceruloplasmin in a hair test. And the other weakness of the hair test, before I answer your question, is that the first thing they do with your hair sample, because I've been to the labs, they chop it up with scissors and turn them into little tiny bits of hair, and then they burn it. They oxidize it. And what that burning process does is it freezes the oxidation state for the metals. They all get +2. Doesn't matter what they were before, they're all +2. Well, copper has at least 2 oxidation states, maybe more. Zinc only has 1. Iron has 6. Manganese has 5. And everything gets frozen to a +2 state. And so I began to question the validity of the results when I learned that. And then when you're talking about the copper dumping that shows up, or the copper toxicity that shows up, again, invariably, people have something in their environment that's causing ceruloplasmin to blow up. Copper's getting released. It's getting bound to something else. And what a lot of practitioners do is assign all of the booga wooga symptoms to, oh, you've got copper toxicity, when in fact it's iron. Trust me, it's iron causing the problem. And there's 50 times more iron in your body than there is copper. And in fact, it's actually more iron than that, because we accumulate a milligram of iron every day we're on the planet. So our bodies as adults are designed to have 5,000 milligrams of iron. Well, you take my age, 70 times 365, and I'm clipping along at about 25,000 milligrams of iron. So that's a 5-fold increase of iron over the course of my lifetime. And what is aging? It's just
Oxidation.
Yeah, but what is aging? It's an easy way of saying iron accumulation.
Mhm.
And so people need to understand that oxidation that you're referring to has been stimulated by the buildup of iron in your tissue because you don't have enough copper in your diet. And so the mainstream, or the narrative of copper toxicity in a hair test, it's just a misunderstanding about how these metals express. And the famed three sisters of copper toxicity, you've got the calcium buildup, and you've got the estrogen buildup, and it's just like, and of course the high copper. It's just, well, iron is playing in the background of all of that. And the hair test doesn't in any accurate way assess what's happening. Again, we're not measuring what's happening to transferrin. We're not measuring what's happening to ferroportin or hepcidin or any of the critical iron proteins. And if you don't have that information, then you're left in the dark. And so I absolutely love the hair test because it gives us this global picture of stress. We're able to assess, can this person generate energy based upon how the ratios sync up with each other? But it's directional. It's not definitive. And I think you know in your own practice, I don't know of one test that is absolutely definitive, but
Right.
collectively, they begin moving us in the right direction of understanding what's going on.
Yeah, one thing I always wondered is I hear some people say, they read a hair mineral analysis and then they recommend a certain number of milligrams of this mineral, certain number of milligrams of that mineral, and you got to do it for this period of time, and then you retest, but they never really looked at the total allostatic load, the total stress load on the body.
That's right.
And does when I see a hair mineral analysis report and they're talking about slow oxidizer, type 1, fast oxidizer, type whatever, can you touch on that? Give us the 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, it's actually a great question. People within the mineral community know about, if they're working with hair tests, they know about fast oxidizers and slow oxidizers. The most fascinating part about it is nobody knows what we know what the mineral ratio is. If we've got calcium divided by phosphorus, ideally it should be about 2.63 to 1. That's considered the ideal balance. If it's below that, if you've got more phosphorus than calcium in that ratio, you're going to be below 2.6, and that's considered a fast oxidizer. And if you're above that, you're a slow oxidizer. And I just happened upon some research that I'd never seen before, and they were studying the calcium phosphorus ratio of pigs and what led to alterations in copper uptake in the pigs. And again, when we're talking about burning things, like burning fuel, that is oxidation. And for the longest time, Tim, I thought that oxidation was referring to the rusting process, the negative oxidation, when in fact, what the fast and slow is really talking about is the positive oxidation, which is called producing energy. And in the study of pigs, the study was from like 1987, the higher the calcium to phosphorus ratio, we would call that a slow oxidizer, the lower the copper uptake was in the liver. And so this rising calcium to phosphorus ratio was a brake preventing copper to get into the system. And what is our liver? Well, it's akin to the battery in our car. It's this immensely important metabolic engine that is storing energy. The liver is basically a warehouse for energy storage. And if it doesn't have copper, it can't function. I mean, it's really designed to store copper and retinol. It's only been in the modern era that they've turned it into an iron depot. And so the fast oxidizer has a faster metabolic, not a faster metabolic rate, but its ability to oxidize is enhanced. And the fast oxidizer loves copper and will burn through magnesium and sodium very quickly. And so you've got to be constantly attentive to the need for magnesium and sodium, as well as copper in the fast oxidizer. The slow oxidizer has this tendency to build up calcium. Calcium's going to rise. And as that calcium rises, they're going to be having greater and greater difficulty bringing copper into their system. And so the whole notion of the fast versus the slow has a different meaning for me now that I see it on the metabolic side, not the rusting side. And so it's really important to get people into a more balanced ratio so that they can have a more optimal uptake of copper, so they can have a more optimal creation of energy and be able to get through the day.
I just had an epiphany, and you tell me if I'm on the right track, but one of the practices I used to work at, we had 3 hard chamber hyperbaric units. And so most people would go up to around 2.8 atmospheres. A lot of people got great results, but some people didn't get any results. And I wonder if they were extremely copper deficient and couldn't utilize the oxygen.
Absolutely. No question about it. I actually am very conservative about adding oxygen and hydrogen. These are very popular modalities. I worry about, can the individual handle the uptick in hydrogen and oxygen if they don't have enough copper? And most people on the planet, certainly anyone in North America who ate a typical diet. I mean, I grew up with Pop-Tarts and Frosted Flakes and things like that. I thought Snickers was a health food, right? And
Right.
so that we've been exposed to a very minerally deficient diet, and copper being at the head of the stream of that. So I think we're facing a sea of symptoms now that are really at the origin lack of energy. And there's all sorts of sophisticated interventions that people use. Basically, it's halfway technology because they're not addressing the energy side, they're addressing symptom side. But I think your epiphany, I think, is spot on. I think that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and I see a lot of people, there are Facebook groups now for the high copper dosing protocol. And I won't name any names, but I hear some people mega dosing
Yep.
copper. What are your thoughts on that? Kind of going to the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, again, as I said, I'm conservative. I spend a lot of time researching and trying to understand the metabolic framework. And I'm very careful about the recommendations I make, in large part because I'm trying to thread a needle that's global. Tim, I get contact from people all over the world thanking me for saving their life. And I'm sure you've had the same experience. And it's just this realization that I want to be very thoughtful about the recommendations that we make within the protocol, and the stops and starts. Or we could easily have 75 stops and 75 starts, and then it would be overwhelming. So we try to limit ourselves to about 10 to 12 stops and 10 to 12 starts. And so we're getting great results though with that. And I think we have to be careful about the mega dosing side of it, because I don't think we have full command of what's the second, third, and fourth order implications of that. So I'm very aware of that side of the community, and I've even had many conversations with that side of the community. We just don't see it the same way, and we have areas of overlap, but we don't agree on the intervention.
So I was going to ask you what's something that you know today that you wish you would have known 10 to 12 years ago, but it sounds like there are several things. Is there a top one or two that you have?
I think probably the most important insight that I came upon, I'd say there are two, and they're related. It took a long while to really embrace the energy paradigm. I mean, when you blow away all the smoke between Pasteur and Béchamp, that's what they were fighting over. Pasteur was fixated on the pathogens that were there because the energy was weak. And Béchamp was saying, well, let's talk about the energetic field. That's really what he was talking about. And when you have optimal energy, there are no pathogens. It's just that they're under regulation. They're not going to be a problem. I think I would have helped to understand that earlier, but again, hindsight's 2020. The other side, or the other component that I wish I'd known, I knew about it, but I didn't understand it or appreciate it. My mentor in the early days, as you probably know, was Rick Malter. The guy's a genius, clinical psychologist, and instrumental in getting me to understand minerals. And very, very grateful for the countless interactions we had. And he had a very important understanding of the HTMA test, hair tissue test. Said there's two things you can learn from it. A, is this person under stress? And ideally, I think his real gift to humanity was what's called the Malter mix. You can take all the results of the hair test and put it in an algorithm to see how they relate to each other. And all of these minerals are supposed to be kissing a red line straight across. They very rarely, I think I've only seen it once. But the important thing is when they're not in alignment with that ideal, the person's in stress. That's important to know that. Second question is, are they able to mobilize energy in the face of stress? And as you know, there's ratios that help us get to that. Are they mobilizing energy? What Rick was also instrumental in getting me to understand is that emotions play a very powerful role in keeping us in balance. And I think that I knew that, like I said, from the early days, but I don't think I really appreciated its central impact until probably in the last couple of years. I think probably what really galvanized it was COVID, and to see the fear component rear its ugly head all over the globe. And I changed the spelling of fear to FE-AR so people could see the word for iron. And what fear becomes is iron activates rust. And then I changed the spelling of the word cure to CU-RE so that people can see the symbol for copper. And then the word becomes copper regulates everything. And this lowly little mineral that people are afraid of, as you noted in the early moments of our conversation, is the Achilles mineral that runs the body. And it's just not taught that way. And it takes a certain resolve and discipline to really understand its impact and to know how compromised copper is in a body that's in a state of fear. And the iron takes over. It changes the neuropeptides. It changes the hormonal function. And I don't think I really truly understood that until the last few years.
I think the issue is that people didn't get their 24th booster.
Ditto. Touche.
Morley, it's been a pleasure. You're a wealth of knowledge. I'm always impressed that you're continuing. I mean, if I retired, I'd probably be on the beach somewhere.
No,
But you're continuing to learn and
absolutely.
contribute. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Put up all your links and contact information on the website, and we'll be in touch for the social media posts, and hopefully we can have a part 2 in the future.
I would love that, Tim. I really enjoyed the conversations. You ask great questions, but there's a fixed area of focus that people have, but you're like out here, which I really appreciate. So thank you for the chance to have that dialogue.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a blessed day.
You as well. You take care.